In this video, I'll demonstrate a technique that I developed for making cast aluminum handles for Western-style knives. In a future video, I'll demonstrate a modification of this technique that I developed for making handles for Japanese-style tantos. I got the idea for this technique years ago while watching a documentary on YouTube about the family-owned American knife-making company, Ruwana Knives. The documentary is called The Bladesmiths, and I recommend that you watch it when you get a chance. I'll leave a link in the description. In that documentary, they show how the handles for Ruwana knives are made by placing the blade in a two-piece permanent mold and then pouring molten aluminum into the mold, effectively casting the handle directly to the tang. It's my understanding that depending on the model, Ruwana knives new sell for between $500 and $1,500. Here's an example of a Ruwana knives Bowie. After watching the documentary, the thought occurred to me that it would be very interesting to come up with a method for making cast aluminum knife handles that any amateur knife maker could use in his garage workshop. Of course, that method would necessarily be simple and inexpensive. After a bit of tinkering, I came up with a process that works extremely well. This video is a demonstration of that technique. My process is based on the idea of lost styrofoam casting. For a very good introduction to backyard lost styrofoam casting, check out this video by the King of Random. It's short and interesting and teaches you everything you need to know. The styrofoam I use is Owens Corning Foamular Polystyrene Insulation. It's much better for casting than packing foam, which is made from little styrofoam beads that are glued together. I cut the styrofoam with my homemade hot wire styrofoam cutter. I'm not going to go into detail about how I made the hot wire cutter in this video. There are tons of videos on YouTube about how to make them, and you can buy them at craft stores and online. Obviously, step 1 is to forge or grind a hidden tang knife blade. Here's mine. If I were trying to make a beautiful finished knife, at this stage I'd also do preheat treatment beveling. But this video is a proof of concept for my handle making method, not a full tutorial on knife making, so I didn't bother to bevel the blade. I begin my handle making process by identifying a knife whose handle I want to copy. In this case, I was lucky enough to find pictures of both the side and top of the handle. I print a full-sized version of each of the photos, trace an outline, and cut out the outline with scissors, making paper templates. Next, I stack 3 layers of styrofoam together. The top layer is a thin sheet that I've cut to exactly the thickness of the tang, and the next 2 layers are each the full thickness of the styrofoam insulation. Then I use the paper template of the side view of the handle to guide me in cutting all 3 layers simultaneously. Next, I position the tang of the knife over the thin piece and trace its shape. Then I cut away that part. Then I use ordinary wood glue to glue the thin piece to one of the thicker pieces, being careful to match up everything exactly. Once the glue has hardened, I glue the remaining piece on top so that the thin piece is now sandwiched between the 2 thicker pieces. Then I use the second paper template to trim the right and left side of the styrofoam pattern to the correct shape and thickness. And this is what the finished styrofoam pattern looks like. Notice that I've attached a piece about 1 inch by 1 inch by 3 inches to the butt end of the pattern. During casting, molten aluminum flows down through this section into the handle. I covered the end of the pattern where the knife blade emerges with a thin layer of plaster of Paris in order to create a smooth stop for the molten aluminum. Okay, here's my setup for casting the handle. I use 2 buckets of sand, one stacked on top of the other. I fill the first bucket a little over halfway with sand. I place the second bucket into the first bucket on top of the sand. Then I pass the knife blade through a slit in the bottom of the second bucket into the sand of the first bucket. Then I place the styrofoam pattern over the tang. And finally, I fill the second bucket with enough sand so that just the very tip of the pattern is exposed over the level of the sand. Once the knife and styrofoam pattern are in place, I pour molten aluminum over the exposed tip of the pattern. I wait 10 minutes for the aluminum to cool and harden, and then I pull the whole thing from the sand. Then I use my knife grinder and hand files to round all the edges of the handle. I could have done this rounding on the styrofoam pattern using the hot wire cutter or my belt grinder or something, but I was concerned I'd make a mistake and ruin the styrofoam pattern, and I thought it would be less likely that I'd make a sudden catastrophic error if I just waited and did this reduction on the aluminum casting. In retrospect, it turned out to be more work than I would have preferred, and I think it would be best to do at least some of this on the styrofoam pattern. And finally, I use belts with scalloped edges to polish the handle from 120 grit up to 600 grit. And here's the finished handle. A few points I need to make. The handles of Ruana knives have a groove or window in the side where a piece of antler, bone, or wood can be inserted. I could have made this handle with a similar groove and inserted a piece of antler or something, but this project was just a proof of concept to demonstrate that the method works, so I didn't worry too much about finishes. Also, for this video I only polished up to 600 grit, again because this is just a proof of concept. If I were making a knife to give to someone as a gift, I'd use buffing wheels to polish the handle to a mirror finish. As an aside, I believe the best way to heat treat a knife after casting an aluminum handle would be to heat the cutting edge to critical temperature using an acetylene torch, and then quench. If you try to heat the entire blade to critical by putting it in your forge, a kiln, or a heat treating oven, you'll melt the aluminum handle right off the tang long before the whole knife reaches temperature. Alright, so here's a summary of my method for making a Western knife with a cast aluminum handle. Forge or grind a hidden tang knife blade. Rough grind the bevels, a step I did not do in this video. Make a styrofoam handle pattern using polystyrene insulation, a hot wire foam cutter, and paper templates. Cast the handle in aluminum, using the method I've demonstrated in this video. Shape and rough polish the handle using files and a belt grinder. Heat treat using an acetylene torch. Temper. If you made a cutout in the handle for placing antler, bone, or wood, add those artistic elements. And finally, polish the handle to a mirror finish and polish and sharpen the blade. Alright, this is my method for making cast aluminum handles for Western knives. In a future video, I'll demonstrate a variation of this method that I use for making handles for Japanese-style tantos. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content.